Fine.
Okay, so did the question make it into the chat? Probably wasn't the best thing that we ended up in the same one, Rachel.
I know. So
Can you boot yourself back out again and ask to be reallocated? Or you can leave room and then you get back to the other guys and do that.
well, then they have to. I think it's okay. I don't think it matters that much.
Yeah, okay.
Then they have to take someone else out just cause a bit of
yeah, just yeah. So I don't see anything in the chat yet. I presume we're looking at step 1 first of all.
Outcomes.
Yeah.
So it's what outcomes would we want to see from a kind of a collaborative governance perspective?
It's what purpose does dialogue serve and what outcomes are we looking for?
Well, the purpose really that the dialogue you want it to serve is that people feel heard. I mean, I think, and meaningfully feeling heard. Isn't that the, a lot of the time it's more tokenistic than actual. So you don't feel that you sit on a committee, throw you on another thing, there's another strategy, but then are things moving on? So there's something about that meaningful engagement from everybody and having the diverse ways of engaging with people, I think would be a huge purpose, certainly from our side. And the outcome you want is everything we want and nothing that they want, probably. But
well, we stick to the purpose first, maybe then come back to the outcome. Would that be the So meaningfully feeling heard, moving from tokenism and a diverse ways of engaging with people. What else do we think the purpose should be?
I think underpinning that or underlying that is the fact that when the state does things or when public bodies do things, they're coming from a limited perspective. You have a diversity of people working in public bodies, but at the end of the day, they're not, or they're often not, of the communities that they're delivering a service for. And they don't have the same lived experience. They're not coming from the same background. And so there's a lack of information, to put it mildly, and a lack of a sensitivity or an understanding in a kind of lived experience way. That's the whole point. So the listening we want them to do, it's to try and at least bridge that gap to a certain extent, if that makes sense. So that's the purpose.
Okay.
It's another sort of linked purpose then to that, Nat, as well as diversity, is bringing that lived experience to their ears. If you're not there, they don't. Yeah, I suppose it says me with the deep sigh when we spent years doing that, and it still doesn't sometimes make any difference. But it's around trying to have mechanisms for that to happen though as well, because it's not always about the representative from the NGO. This is the challenge with it's about having the real life experience. So bringing, for example, when we get a new principal officer, we try and bring the principal officer out on the ground and meet the adult literacy learners, not just listen to us talking about it. So it's that trying to, the richness and the bringing them into their world, I think can be quite, and that's the importance of the dialogue, is around having a conversation and trying to share that with them.
Absolutely. And I think again, to state the obvious, we're particularly concerned for the disadvantaged and marginalized communities, those who have faced discrimination, those who are most distant from or who least have the resources to engage with the state themselves. So the state needs to more than meet them halfway. The state needs to go on a journey to engage with those communities. And I mean, there are good examples of good practice. I mean, I remember talking to Dublin City Council people who, for example, just for street design, they go on these walking tours as if they were an older person. They'll walk out the door where the person lives and they'll walk around the streets and they'll note every single aspect of the footpath, the crossings, how near or how distant are bus stops and shops and so on. So you know, engagement can happen. There's good examples of it, but it's that very much, as you say, getting officials to engage in so many different ways. Because I guess what I take from the paper on collaborative governance, it's not just about the conversation that Taoiseach might have with some people, but it's a way of working that we want to cascade down at every level across the system.
Mhm. I think it's also about building, and maybe this is what you've already touched on, but building capacity. So it's about building our capacity as a sector to engage in collaborative approaches, because we're not used to it, because we do it in our own organizations and with the communities we work, but we're not really used to doing it with the state. Proper, real, meaningful planning and engagement at that level. So there's a certain bit about building our own capacity, the state, public servants, civil servants needing to build their capacity to engage. And then it's about building relationships and trust. Because if you don't have that, if you can't have a frank and honest conversation about the barriers and the blocks, then it becomes very difficult to find the solutions. So there has to be trust established through that collaborative process. And there has to be, like we would have found it in our work with the Department of Rural and Community Development, where we started from and where we are now with particular civil servants. We've gone a journey. So you talked about the state going a journey. We all went on a journey. So, you know, and I think that that's part of it, is that it's the purpose of it is also about trying to build ways of working together that actually work. And it is negotiation. There's always going to be negotiation and give and take and all of that. But I think for us, for me anyway, it's about that capacity bit and that relationship building and that kind of trust building as well.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I suppose, having said, let's talk about purpose first and then outcomes. For me, the purpose is the outcome, and the outcome is better policy, better strategic planning, better whatever the issue is, whether you're talking about resources and allocating resources or developing policy or whatever it is, it's about the outcome, you know, and I truly believe that policy is better when the state does all of those things, when the state engages, when the state realizes that their perspective is not reflecting the people the policy is directed at, or the plan is, whatever it is, and the policy is better, is therefore better. And for me, that is the purpose. So yeah, for me, the outcome is the purpose.
And if I can jump in on that, I think it's worth teasing it out to be really clear that we don't just want the state to listen at the implementation phase, when it's about, okay, we're now going to implement this and let's fine tune it. It's also about having those listening and genuine dialogues at an early stage to shape policy. And I think that's there's the biggest barriers there, because there is for a variety of reasons, and some good, some bad, there are barriers to doing that with a lot of different departments and agencies. They don't want to engage in a discussion about policy. They'd be quite happy maybe to talk about, you know, fine tuning the rollout of something, but they don't want to get into flaws that we might perceive in the policy, or that the community that they're meant to serve may see the flaws. So that's an important aspect of this, because they could do lots of listening, but they have to be willing to actually have the dialogue on policy.
Yeah, one of the things I suppose that we learned from that work that Rachel described, and also just even by looking at some of the literature that Chris put our way, is that one of the fundamental prerequisites is that the state needs to be willing not just to listen, but to act on what they hear. So they need to be willing to take on board what has been said and to transfer that into, again, if it's a planned action, if it's a policy, better policy. So there needs to be a willingness on the part, and leadership on the part of the state.
If I may, I think that exposes the hierarchical nature of a lot of public agencies, that the top manager is the one who might be talking to a department, or talking to, you know, interacting with the minister, whereas the type, you know, the lower level official who gets rolled out to do public listening exercises or dialogue has no mandate to, you know, and it's difficult then, because you're trying to give them something that they can feed back up a chain And it's how can we, make that work better?
Mm.
And I would say the weakness of local government and the weakness of even the local governance of, say, HSE, CHO areas or whatever it might be, means that so much things are centralized that there are relatively few decision makers. So you can't have a dialogue with your local town council to change things. We don't have town councils anymore. So policy is really centralized, which is another barrier. But I think it's a fundamental structural problem with the Irish state. And it's, extremely anomalous compared to most other European countries.
There's also a lack of capacity of expertise in areas as well. That's what we're finding. So you can have your strategy and your bits, and then the civil servants don't have that expertise to deliver on it. And you're asking for things that they can't deliver, and you're in, there's a whole other thing. So again, engaging with us in a way where, and I think you're so right about the building the trust and the relationship building, because the things, even in the strategy we have, that they didn't put in. So we didn't win everything. We haven't won them, and they're gone now in its current iteration, and we then have to go back to the drawing board and look at how we now get other bits that weren't in it, but keeping them with us. So that there's a lot of balancing. As Rachel said, there's probably a whole capacity building nature for everybody that in a more formal way, I think we call it that, and some of us either are lucky enough, and then you have a good civil servant who can be brilliant for you for a period of time, and then they leave. You're like,
but
damn,
that's the thing as well. Like, how would these kind of more collaborative approaches help us with that? Because that's what we all find. You've got your people, they're great, then they're gone, and like, where's your man? So they've moved on, and somebody else comes in, and there's no relationship, there's no trust, and we've really experienced that lately. No trust, no relationship, no anything. Haven't spent years building it up, and then suddenly, you're dealing with somebody else, and it's very different. So maybe these kind of broader collaborative processes that are based on these principles, that are very clear, that they're not depending on one or two sort of sympathetic civil servants who have some kind of a bit of, I don't know, social conscience or something, and decide that they're going to do it a particular way. So do you think that a different approach would help with that?
Well, I think we're looking for that to be the new way of doing business. Like, if the Taoiseach really want to do social dialogue, there should be a new rule, or like the public sector equality and human rights duty, like, a lot of other things, and they get cascaded down. And particularly from DPER sends out memos, this is the way you have to do business. And, they all jump when it's GDPR, but they should all be jumping when the rule says, look, you have to do a certain amount of engagement with the public, and it has to be serious, it has to be genuine. But that structure doesn't exist. There's nothing. We've had false dawns, like the year 2000 white paper on engagement with the community voluntary sector, and that faded away. Here we are 20 years later, and there's a new paper, but it's still all, loose. They haven't built up a structure through which public agencies are required to systematically engage with the communities they're working with. And it's expensive, it's maybe slow, but of course we say also you can save an awful lot of time and money by talking to people the first time around, rather than making the mistakes or creating policy that doesn't work. So I think we can make a case for this. This is not it doesn't have to be a massive, cumbersome, inefficient thing. It actually can be a win-win that helps make better policy and lead to better implementation of that policy. Now, it's a hard sell, but I think it can be made.
And I think that, this government is sort of priding itself on wanting to do things differently, and social dialogue is part of that. But if you look at what they're saying, what they're talking about in terms of open government partnership and renewing that process, and also the development of this well-being framework, that they seem to on the face of it at any rate, to want to do things differently. But how can that then get embedded? Because that requires a change in culture. and again, to move away from, as Rachel was saying, that, you know, the one or two sympathetic civil servants that you really want to hold on to, but then they move off and you've somebody else. So how could that culture change? You know, so how can it become part of the culture as opposed to just, you know, this is this government's, you know, hobby horse at the moment, as opposed to really becoming something that's entrenched.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose in one sense, and the cross-governmental piece is interesting, because you kind of, you know, it's nearly the equality, the marginalised disadvantage that we use, but it's an awful, you know, negative term in its own sense. So it's something about underpinning everything, that they should be doing nothing. And I'm not using equality proof, because they have a set of principles that do a certain thing, but that everything should be looked at from a checklist nearly of, have you engaged with, you know, the relevant groups, have you done whatever, and that you're ticking them off. Did you have meaningful consultation? Was everything in plain English? I mean, it's a gobshite question, but it's a very obvious one, that most of the stuff isn't actually in plain English. Yeah. So all of us are spending more time trying to work out what they're saying, or for people who can't read and people whose English isn't their first language, they're not even engaging at all. So something about maybe engaging principles that would have to be taken on board. And then that needs to be rolled out in a training program, being honest. So that's back to deeper again through the One Learning. Every civil servant should go on a program of meaningful engagement, or whatever we call it, to do with dialogue, and something, and that doesn't have to be long. You know, that could be like literally a 2.5 hour, you know, an hour of giving information and an hour and a half of workshopping. It's just to start off, just to see. So I definitely think training or something in it needs a pilot or something on it.
Like, I think it's complicated enough in the sense that we're looking to move from consultation, which is where we are at now, or tokenism. Like, if you're looking at that ladder of participation business, we're looking to move from consultation and tokenism to collaboration and co-design kind of thing. So, and that's a process. It's not a one-off meeting. It's not a one-off, oh yeah, we consulted with them and we said goodbye and then we went off and did our own thing anyway, which is what we all know happens. Or worse, we got a private company to do it on our behalf, and they consulted with them and gave us a report, and now we're just taking that report and we're going away. So there is a shift, and they're increasingly doing that. They're increasingly getting, what do you call that, your friends, Anne?
It's different economic consultants like Mazars, or like
Mazars, yeah,
or there's a few of them. Yeah. Endicon is the other one. Yeah.
So they're the ones who are doing the consulting now often, and you don't see them again. So, you know, the things are getting worse since the white paper, obviously, rather than better. So we are looking for something fairly fundamental in terms of shifts. Now, and in the paper, like Orla did put in the stuff that they did with justice around the violence against women piece. And that actually was is proving to be quite a successful, positive experience. So there are some models, but they need to become more the mainstream rather than the exception.
But even in, you know, and limited, you know, as it was, but it was better than most in terms of putting together the DRCD strategy and the way that was done. Putting it together was one thing. Implementing it has been a whole other experience, where we've been told, okay, these are our priorities for the year. And we say, well, we didn't agree those, but at the next meeting, they become the agreed priorities. And we've got loads of examples of that. So, and one of the things that happened is back to the personality that led the development of the policy moved, you know, so we were left with a whole other load of personalities trying to persuade them that's not what that was about. So there is a real issue. I think there's a real issue around that personality based thing, where you do get one or two good people and then the next thing they're gone, and you're either find yourself having to start again if you're lucky, or worse.
Yeah.
Okay, we're closing now.
Countdown.
Thanks, everybody. Oh, we've another 57 seconds.
We've another 50 seconds, but just to jump in, I think it's important we have as many examples, practical examples of things that have worked as possible. Also, there's real advantages to doing things online, but it excludes an awful lot of people. So I think we have to be careful that actually they could share a lot of information and do a lot of things online, but they need to find a way to include everybody with offline methods as in parallel to that.
Yeah.
That's a bit of a challenge as
Yeah.
well, because I wouldn't dismiss the online consultations because they can be efficient and so on, but you know how we balance that, because loads of people are not on the internet or just can't engage with that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
The problem is we don't have loads of good examples.
I suppose we have to try and maybe from abroad as well, if we can find them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of them seem to be local from the stuff that, like, you know, local budgeting and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Chris gone.
Chris got booted out.
Except Chris, what did you do tonight?
I couldn't, the record button didn't work, so what I did is I took notes in the chat and I've saved the chat.
Oh, okay, sorry.
They're very rough notes, mind you. But
and did it work for you? I mean, I recorded, but I noted as well. But sorry,
I did both, and I think I saw Rachel writing as well, so she probably took a few notes. Here's Chris back again now.
Where did you go, Chris?
That'd be kind of helpful if I didn't knock myself out of the meeting, wouldn't it? Anyway, I was just testing my reactions there.
How did you do?
I was fairly good, yeah. I had the heart monitor on there. It didn't start going too bonkers, so it was all right. So just to I might just take some notes as we're going along here. So without necessarily being, you know, in any particular order of groups or anybody reporting on the group, does anybody want to offer anything about what discussion was there around outcomes that engagement with the state or collaboration or dialogue, what they would have? Tara, I don't know if your microphone is working. If not, we just keep an eye on the chat. Anybody want to start off?
I was in group 3, but I can start. Oh, sorry, Nash, I think you were starting.
Oh, well, I just jump in with one remark rather than going through everything we discussed, because we discussed quite a lot of things, but just the outcome we're looking for is for the state to adopt a new way of working, where it values talking to the people who are on the other end of publicly funded services, and who are citizens or residents of Ireland. And that it isn't enough for that to be sort of a guideline or a standard. It would need to be rules. It would, you know, it'll need training, and it'll need to be, you know, rolled out using models of best practice for this new way of working to be meaningful. And so I suppose that's the ideal outcome that we're looking to achieve. I mean, it's not where we are now, and it's not where we're likely to be in the next few years. But I think if we're going to set out our stall for, you know, what other countries do successfully and the value of that, I think we're looking for that new way of working, put it that way.
Okay, and so I suppose just to clarify, I suppose is the purpose of both, I suppose there's the purpose of this exercise, but also then the purpose of engaging with the state in the first place. What outcomes do you want from that? So the purpose from this particular exercise, is to get the state to adopt a new way of working, but from the actual engagement with the state, what is that supposed to deliver?
Sure. I mean, underpinning that is that all of the different people and their diverse lived experience and their different backgrounds, I mean, the state and the public officials don't have that information. They don't have that lived experience. And if they did, they'd design different policies and they'd implement them differently. And so it's about better policy making, better implementation, but also the respect and, you know, engagement with the people who are usually just the passive recipients of whatever the state decides to do. So it's a total change in how we engage with people. And again, my own view is that it's part of the issue is the highly centralized nature of the Irish state compared to most other states in Europe. But there's lots of other cultural and political reasons for why we don't do this as well as we should. While there's some good examples, there's lots of examples where it's really just top down.
But it is ultimately about better policy making. I think, you know, better policy making because the state does all of this and because the state listens and because the state engages. But it is about better policy, and not just policy, because I think we can't underestimate the importance of planning at national, regional and local level. So it is not just policy, but it is planning as well.
Something we didn't say, it's also processes for democracy. You know, it's not just about the policy, it's like how people engage with the state. You know, it's like I am a resident or citizen, I can engage with the state in outside the formal election process.
Okay. So it's kind of big move beyond representative. Seem to remember back in the mid-90s sometime when the Constitution Review Group was being put together, and we made a submission that participatory democracy needed to be recognised in the Constitution. That didn't get very far really at the time, but anyway, it's kind of I'm sure they must have the submission someplace in a file someplace. But anybody else, Mary?
I was just going to that part there about the purpose and the outcome and all of that. And I suppose state to adapt to new way of working, but there has to be a shift. It's going to require a shift within the state to actually change how it views community engagement, because to date it is all about consultation. You know, so I mean, there is like the ideal. I know we're talking about ideal, and you're saying what is the outcome? The outcome of collaborative governance is a society in which people are treated equally, in which people have access to good health services, education services, transport, a society in which families and children are valued, which all people are valued. It's a society that doesn't have to think twice in terms of their policies if they're developing something for a person, you know, around people with, you know, a person who uses a wheelchair or somebody, you know, who's deaf. Like there's a whole range of different things here in terms of what is the desired outcome. So that is the desired outcome. It's all of those things. And how unfortunately it does require, and it's not just in monetary terms. And I think this is a part that government has to hear very, very strongly from all of us in the community sector, that it is not just monetary. It is societal change. It is, you know, yeah, sorry, that's enough.
Okay, anybody else want to?
Yeah, Chris, on that, yeah, I mean, that is the point there about informing better policy and so on, that was covered here also, including different cultural needs, different groups you represent and how we represent those and bring those forward to inform kind of better policy making. But linked to what I suppose Mary was saying there as well is that in a sense we're promoting the interests of groups and been trying to vindicate the rights of people in society as well, and the state is the rights holder in many cases, so you're trying to bring about and vindicate those rights with the state in order to bring about the change to vindicate those rights. So the state has to be accountable in that case as well. So one of the point I think that we raised as well was kind of, we hadn't really thought about in our discussion in the subgroup was, do we or do we not separate out the permanent government and the elected government in terms of how we're engaging as well, and does that inform you know, the different approaches we take to engagement? And that often it's the permanent government that we're trying to influence, and they're the ones sometimes they could be harder to shift because of their kind of very set ideas and sometimes reluctance to change how things are going. That was, so I don't know if anybody else in that group wants to add anything there, but that was kind of one thing we hadn't thought about, I suppose, before. But it's, you know, does that inform then how we engage? You know, if we're trying to look at the different groups.
Anybody else want to add? Because what's coming across here certainly is a clear distinction between process outcomes and product outcomes, whether it's in terms of policy or outcomes for people, as opposed to outcomes that are around the process. And I suppose it's fair enough to distinguish between those. Sorry, Breed, you were...
Yeah, just and I took very rough notes in the chat, so I'm now reading back some of my very rough notes. But anyway, people whose experience is, you know, that they're actively involved in the monitoring of implementation and delivery of services was, you know, one. And then just the thing around people have a right to have their say in their area. are on their issue, need to ensure that those who are not often heard are really listened to, because those people had concerns around and felt the reason some of the responses through community call was very much the great and the good were listened to, rather than maybe those who are really hard pressed by all that was going on. And then I suppose then we need processes that are capable of doing this, that really processes that have the capacity to really listen to people. And again, just that whole concern of, you know, that people feel, yeah, there's lots of consultations, lots of calls for this and the other, but no real sense of feedback or where it's all going or how it's been used. You know, and then the impact that then has when you're trying to maybe encourage somebody to get involved in something, if they then ask quite legitimately, well, why, when there is so little, when maybe those who've been previously involved haven't felt there was any feedback, any real engagement, any real sense of being heard. And then how difficult it can be then to keep, you know, community involvement going if that's been people's experiences.
Okay. Anybody else? So forgive me if these are just rough notes here. I just thought it's handy to put them up for visibility. Hopefully it's helpful. Rachel?
Yeah, just in terms of Nat was saying there at the very top bullet, we were talking about the state to adopt a new way of working. And I suppose in the context of that point, we were saying that very often when you are engaging, even in good processes, and we do have one or two that we can name, it depends on the civil servant. It depends on a couple of people who actually give a shit and who actually want to talk to you. So like when they go, we all know they're gone, and then we're back to square one with somebody else who hasn't got a clue, who you've no relationship with, there's no trust, there's nothing. So it's about trying to find ways to build those processes into the mainstream. So it doesn't depend on the individual who happens to be good or happens to see your perspective, but it's nearly mandatory. And I don't know how you make that happen, but that's, you know, we need to find ways to get around that constant movement of people, and then sort of that whole lack of expertise, the people with who build a bit of expertise moving out of the picture. So I think that's part of the trying to figure out a new way of working in that way. And then I was just thinking there when we were talking, so we're talking about an outcome in better policy, better practice, better programs, better all of those things. But also I think an outcome from really good collaborative processes probably would be that people feel more connected. They feel a sense of ownership over things. They feel, you know, that whole piece around more social cohesion, more sense of, yeah, ownership, belonging, responsibility to others. You know, the more you're engaged, the more you feel a part of things. So I think that the stronger, and I think even the citizens' assemblies, those kind of models have shown that people really get engaged. They really feel, they appreciate the fact that they're involved, and they like it, you know. So there's this a very positive sort of energy around that kind of collaboration that can have very good spin-off effects in terms of society generally, just by the fact of being involved.
Okay. I suppose obviously there's a challenge here if the talk is mainly around a national level process, and this is, I suppose, I remember Pádraig Flynn once upon a time when he was a minister or a commissioner saying, you know, if everybody wanted to be involved in all of these things, you'd have to rent out Croke Park and bring everybody along for the day, amongst many of the famous things that Pádraig Flynn once upon a time said. But so this, you know, obviously this all has to be filtered out, and some of these principles apply, I suppose, at different levels as well. So
Chris, if I could just listen to so one thing that occurred to me is I'm trying to think what we are trying to do here, or what the outcome of it is, because I have no problem with the general statement that, you know, the reason we want to engage is we want to transform the way the state does its work, and we want to involve, you know, people who are currently ignored and all that sort of stuff. But it's not a good way of starting a conversation. Like, that's the sort of thing that you do once you get in the door. You don't ask to get into the door to do those things, because if they were willing to do those things, you wouldn't need to be asking. Mm-hmm. So I do think there's a tendency for us to front load the most, the things that the establishment are most likely to reject, rather than look for a sequence of things that we might sort of win them over with while we keep our desire to totally transform them in our rucksack until we actually sit down around the table. So I think, I mean, that's a sort of a tactical question, but it struck me in terms of some of the things that people are saying here. I totally agree with, but they're just, you know, every door would close and be locked if you make that as part of your opening, anywhere near your opening presentation, I think.
I personally wouldn't necessarily see it as kind of how we'd lay out our stall. It's more, this is what we would like it to do. But then I do think, yes, we then need to think through in a document that will be used, particularly with the state, how then would we lay out the stall so indeed the door will be open. Yeah.
Except that I do think that at face value, I'm saying this in the small group, at face value, this government sees itself doing things differently. So if you look at what's going on in relation to social dialogue, in relation to the wellbeing framework that they're developing, in relation to the open government partnership that they're reinvigorating, whether or not it all comes to naught is a different argument. But they do kind of pride themselves on saying we're going to do things differently. So that might just be a little bit of leverage. Now you can be very jaundiced and say this will all come to naught, and I would be slightly, but that might just be something to look at.
And then maybe just taking on Mike's kind of challenge there. So if you were 3 years into this process, and sorry, Nat, you go ahead there. Yeah.
Sorry, Chris, no, you finish.
No, it was just maybe if I just pose this question and then you come back on it. So it's kind of, if you were to judge this after 3 years, what would a successful process of engagement look like? So, for example, it might be that there is a different way of working. That isn't necessarily something you have to go in and demand, but that you can see it. But what are the kind of things, if you're saying, right, we're going to give this 3 years, and after 3 years, we're going to decide, are we going to stay here or not? Because it's producing the things we want to produce it or not. So what are the kind of the indicators? What are the kind of things that you would judge it against? Nat, sorry, you had.
Yeah, well, what I was going to suggest is that, I mean, there are some examples of good practice where both policy has been formulated and also services delivered involving co-design or cooperation with the communities affected. And I think we need more of those, more from abroad if necessary, and to show that they add value, in very pragmatic ways, that they can save time, they can save money, they can make a policy work better, they can, avoid, speed bumps down the line, or reversals of policy because people are upset. So there are ways to sell this, I suppose, to a skeptical officials, that if you put in good processes, you can get a better result. And I think that helps build a bridge to answer Mike's question about where we are now and where we might like to be. Well, I think it's building on the good practice examples helps make the case that it's not just pie in the sky or some sort of utopia that we're describing, but there's actually there's real value to be generated by it. And so what might things look like in 3 years? We want to see more concrete examples. We want to see at least guidelines, if not rules, being drawn up for departments to engage in this kind of exercise, and best practice standards and internal training in departments. There's a whole lot of practical steps that you'd want to see delivered to show that the state is genuinely wanting to do this. Much as, I'd be looking to see in a few years' time whether the Equality Human Rights Duty, is there training, are there standards about how that's being done to give us more confidence that they're taking that seriously, and that likewise remains to be seen.
Okay.
Is it, sorry, just on, I mean, when we're talking about going into again, we're talking about the ideal here, because I mean, as a collaborative governance, if that's what we're aiming at, we should all be going in as equal partners. And the reality is that does not happen. We know that. And I mean, again, I understand what you're saying is in terms of what would be a success in 3 years' time. A success 3 years' time is that people are sitting around the table as equal partners with an equal say. Now, again, that is the ideal. And obviously, I mean, clearly, we've been around, some of us have been around long, and I haven't necessarily been at a national level in terms of negotiations around, the social partnerships, etc. But a lot of people here even have been. And like, it has not gone beyond the consultations part. Like, we know that they've got consultation. They do not understand participation and real participation, either at local level or at a national level. And like, if we cannot ask government at this stage, what are you going to bring as well to ensure that there is good, even if they want to call it social dialogue, whatever language they're using, they have to come in with an openness and a willingness to acknowledge that what they've been doing has not achieved what it said on the tin. Now, I'm well aware that there's people in this country think it has worked wonderfully. But I would say, again, come to the people on the ground and we can tell you exactly how it has worked.
Okay, sorry, Ijel, I think you were going to come in there as well earlier on. Did I miss your hand?
No, you're fine. Yeah, I was just thinking of like the idea of hustings, you know, for civil servants, because I think there's something that's missing around meeting people face to face, you know, hearing people's stories. There's nothing like stories and people's experiences to change how you feel. But if that's not built into how you develop your policy, so for me, like, it's an outcome is that one step in your delivery of policy is that you need to get out, like the PO, the Assistant General Secretary, whoever it is, they have to go and meet people. They have to go and meet, and not in a, like, we've had bad examples of that. Paul, the Social Inclusion Forum and all them have been kind of a disaster. So, but it's something else. It's not that. I suppose I'm thinking more around, like, if you're a political representative, you have to meet people, you have to hear what they say, not that you might do anything about it, but there's something about stories and meeting people that really you cannot ignore. It's why we're involved in this work, is because we meet people, stories, we hear people's stories, we're affected by them, we want to make change because we hear them. If you're a civil servant, you don't hear those stories. And so that has to be built in some way, I think, to policy making. And yeah.
Okay, thanks, Ijel. I'm just wondering whether we might switch on to the second question and break you back into groups and that. But just before we do that, something Ijel said there reminds me that, so the OECD did a report on the Irish public sector reform strategy from 2014 to 2016. They produced it in 2017, and they identified certain kind of capacity areas that were necessary for the Irish public sector. 3 of them were curiosity, storytelling, and insurgency, which kind of strange kind of capacities that, you know, they would talk about. But again, the OECD isn't the most radical organization in the world, but so curiosity, storytelling, and insurgency were the kind of things that they wanted public officials to be able to develop.
Sorry, Chris, can I just come in on that one? Because there is something though in this about, because yeah, I agree with what Ijel is saying. There's something about them being obliged to immerse themselves in the issue a bit because of the approach in the Irish civil service, this what they call the generalist civil servant, so that they move. So by the time they do get a bit immersed, they've moved, and then you're starting sort of again with people. So there isn't that sort of commitment to get really, you know, deep into the issue, because also they know they're going to move as well. So yeah, I don't know. The more I think about that, I think that is important, because when you think, now I know sometimes we really crap civil servants, so we're quite glad that they're moving, but the time bit does help to build the relationship, and that they get it. You know, it's harder for them to ignore the issues. So yeah. So
a bit of immersion. Turn off the immersion. Don't forget to turn off the immersion.
But it goes back to induction, I think, Chris.
Yeah.
Like, how are you trained in the civil service?
Exactly, yeah.
It's like, it's from the very beginning of, with what you just said, the curiosity. It's like, what do I need to know about my role and what I'm responsible? I mean, it's much bigger than what we're talking about, but it has to permeate everything.
But it's also handover. Sorry, I shut up then. It's also handover from civil servant to civil servant, because very often institutional memory can be lost when you have a new civil servant coming in. It appears to me anyway, the handover is never good, that the new person has to go back and start from the beginning again. And that takes ages at times. So I just would add handover into those things.
Yeah.
But I think there's also a reality where a lot of them, particularly the senior civil servants, very much see themselves as being answerable to the minister, and that it's so they take the lead from the minister. Now, where we have seen change, it's when you've got a minister who wishes to move things along and a civil servant who has the capacity to do it. So I do think some of them can manage that quite well. I think others then very much they expect the minister to do the leading, and if the minister then is relying on the civil service, so you can end up in a loop that's not at all helpful between those dynamics, unfortunately.
Okay, maybe we could switch into the second of the fourth of the steps, really, which was really just trying to, without this being a precise exercise in design, it's about identifying the mechanisms that the community platform would be proposing that would deliver some of these outcomes in a way that represents best practice. So whatever way these get formed, obviously they're not going to be fully fledged, fully worked out mechanisms, but at least if you could begin to identify what would these mechanisms look like, and again based on some of the best practice experience that you're aware of. So I've just set up.
Chris, could I just qualify, because out of the conversation earlier about the permanent government and representative government, because I think that elected stuff is important in terms of mechanisms as well. So I think we should talk about that too.
Yeah, and I suppose this is one of the things to bear in mind, maybe some past experience, particularly around social partnership, where some of the challenges that were levelled at it were around the hierarchy of power, something Mary was referring to, levels of accountability and levels of democratic legitimacy, particularly in terms of engaging with elected representatives. I think feeds very much in, Edel, with what you just said. So just to bear those in mind, maybe in the background. Okay, so I'm running a little bit behind. So if we take about 15 minutes for this thing this discussion, to send back any ideas, and they could be incorporated into the document. So we'll have 3 rooms again this time, and so we'll just take 15 minutes if that's all right, and I'll post the question into the room again. Yeah, here we go.
Back again. You're on mute, Anne.
I was just wondering if Helen was with us.
Back again, yeah. It took a while just to go in. Funny.
Yeah. So designing of engagement mechanisms.
I think, just to pick on something that Mary was saying there, and I'm just not sure I fully understood it, in the sense of this idea that the ideal is in collaborative governance, we all go in as equals. I mean, I think that is I think equality is the basis of collaborative governance. But I don't think anyone is suggesting that the national level of social partnership or social dialogue, as it may get called, is going to necessarily work that way, because you can't have 5 million people walking into a room. There's going to be a representative governance arm, and we have that through the Oireachtas, and we will have it the highest levels of social dialogue. But the whole point of the ways of working is that it needs to go down the chain, that the further down you go, the closer you get to the people, the more collaboration and the more equality there is in the engagement with people. And that's often the missing piece, because what happens in reality is the closer you get to the people, the more authoritarian it is and the more top down it is, because people say, well, it's not my job, I'm just told what to do by them's upstairs. And that's where it all breaks down. So I just wasn't sure how that was being understood generally. I mean, I could be wrong about how I was taking that up.
Maybe I'm not quite understand. So your point is that
my point is that you're going to have collaborative governance. We want to have collaborative governance where collaborative governance is going to work, but it's not going to work in a room with the Taoiseach. Now, we'd like the Taoiseach to sit down with 10 people on a fairly equal basis and talk to employers, trade unions, environmentalists, and community voluntary sector people, but they'll all be representatives, and in a way that has to be a representative forum. And all that goes with that in terms of accountability and people reporting back and so on. But if I'm Dublin City Council and I'm going to make some serious changes to how we run one of my buildings, my apartment block with 50 people in it, then they should be down on the ground talking to those 50 people, help with co-design, delivery of a change, and not only of services, but of their overall policy. There should be that, you know, dialogue with people and, you know, choice and control given to people and respected by officials. And it's that, if you like, pyramidal structure that, you know, you want collaborative governance on the ground and you want to build it up as much as you can. But yes, it's going to have to interact and intersect with representative forms of governance too. It's not all going to work one way, you know, in the same way that we're also going to have referendums, which are direct democracy, and we're also going to have, you know, elections and so on and so forth. It's how all that works together. And at the moment, the problem is that the collaborative governance or the participative democracy is the weakest part of the state. It's the bit we do least. And it's the bit they do well in Nordic countries through local government. And I'm sure they do it well in various places around the world, where we just do it badly. And that's the bit that we want to inject in. And I suppose through the opportunity to engage with the Taoiseach and Taoiseach's department as they're considering social dialogue, we want them to think beyond the meetings that might be held at a top level and think through to the way in which the state should engage with its people. And that's the big constitutional change, if you like.
Like, I think one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that collaborative governance takes time. It actually takes quite a lot of time. And depending what you're working on, I mean, you can be talking about months and months and years actually of work and a huge amount of time from each person involved. And you're not going to get ministers engaged at that level. You're just not. But I think what needs to happen is there needs to be a delegation. So the minister needs to be in favor of this happening and delegate it down to somebody who still is appropriately at a level that is appropriate to the decisions that need to be taken, that ultimately then get referred on to the and that is probably where it interacts with representative democracy, because particularly at national level, ultimately it is a minister who will make the decision. But I do in terms of, you know, designing of engagement, collaborative and collaborative mechanisms, I think that has to be a consideration, is the sheer amount of time it takes to do this and to fight over every I dotted and every T that's crossed. And that maybe then it is about looking to see at what level is appropriate to do that in-depth work.
But would the Citizens' Assembly model, just to looking at that on a large issue, like what's been our experience of it for delivering on certain topics that we couldn't progress otherwise, and whether we'll ever get one on housing or whatever way it may, I mean, because that is an interesting mechanism that takes the 100 random people if there was no representative people there, and you might have been lucky to be landed on it. So that is an interesting, I wonder how that would work now if you took it down into the local government concept as well, because the big difference, the bit that this representative stuff, and then there's lobbying. So like the employers are paid, they've people, the trade unions have people, we lobby. So many of us are in roles where we lobby and that has a transparency and a bill and a thing on it. Whereas this piece about sort of engaging with you is where they randomly go out and say, right, let's find a few folks out on the ground. And it's that process of how they do it as well. Like it's quite, anyway, look, I'm not making
the random selection is always going to leave out loads of groups that we're talking about, because they just won't be, like, even if they were on the electoral register, which many of them aren't, the random selection, the nature of random selection would automatically not include people. So the random selection is always going to be is going to be an issue. There's no doubt about that. But then, like, I would have been very skeptical about the Citizens Assembly, but even the name Citizens Assembly at the start. But I think it has delivered really interesting things.
I think that brings us that brings an issue to a certain level, or it takes you along the road to a certain point where the Citizens Assembly is making recommendations.
Yeah, and
then it stops.
Yeah.
So we will take them or we won't take them, and goodbye and thank you for sitting here for whatever number of weekends, you know. But that's limited in terms of it has proven to be quite a good model, I think, but it only goes so far. And we're looking for more than that. We're looking to probably build on those kind of initiatives and that kind of creativity, but we want more involvement in the implementation of the recommendations or the design of how you might implement those recommendations.
Yeah,
I think just
so that's the suggestion I put into the thing there just before we got bumped. Well, is really then we need to co-design at this stage with them. So the suggestion isn't it's not even we need a new model. We need a co-design process with the state to develop a model together. And it's not just principles. I put principles in, I should have put processes in as well as processes. And together we go through a journey, we call it that, where we come up with, and there'll be arguing back and forth about what that's going to look like, of course, but at least understanding and who sits on it, and you've all that bloody lark too. And anyway, but imagine we could get to a room with the people that could put it together, and then as the training piece on that, and it needs evaluation points all the time and would you try it in one department before another, or are you sweeping it out over the whole? I mean, this is where we struggle with the government department because our issue crossed 9 government departments. So we're now sitting on a bloody interdepartmental working group of 9 departments, one agency that's not, you know, so it's all becomes so much of a, and they're probably delighted to stick us in on that for the next 10 years. That'll shut us up. You're busy enough now. How much time do you have to critically think what you know, are doing? So, yeah,
I think that lobbying question too is an important one. So you're and you're saying they're happy to have us there because they're also happy to have you there wasting your time. So you're not doing the other campaigning work maybe, which might even be more effective. But there's always been that question of in or out in terms of social partnership back in the day. You know, is that we spend all our time in these flipping rooms negotiating nothing. Instead, we should be on the streets. But that is always going to be a question, and it's not one or the other. I think, you know, we hold the right to protest, and you know, but all we're looking for here is kind of different ways of doing business, and hopefully getting some good outcomes from those processes. But I do think that lobbying bit is important.
Like you were talking earlier, Rachel, about the importance of, you know, seeing a change being made on behalf of something that you've been involved in. And but I think, like, if you look at the 2 most recent referendums where young people have seen a real impact because they got involved, but that was lobbying and came. Now I know there was all sorts of stuff went on, and it was a kind of a bringing together really of all forms of society and democracy and that. But I do think, you know, it's about seeing change as a result of your involvement, and whether that is as a result of engaging in collaborative processes or standing outside and throwing stones and saying we want to change. So long as the change happens, the mechanism, I think, can differ.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of mechanisms, I think, you know, we in the initial kind of few lines that myself and Orla put together, we talked about the importance of having mechanisms that are flexible, responsive, that we're not just going to have one mechanism that you say, okay, well, what is the area that we want to work on? What's the current issue here? This is the kind of structure that we need for that. These are the people that we need to be at the table. This is the, you know, and I think in terms of mechanisms, rather than setting out, oh, we need a committee on this and we need a collaborative committee on that or whatever, that we do set out, you know, kind of a framework for making a decision, a framework for deciding on who should be at the table, a framework, more setting out what the process should look like rather than getting stuck into what the mechanism might look like.
So you're talking about then bespoke mechanisms according to whatever is on the table, and that part of that would be a framework for designing the
within a
process.
framework. Yeah.
For designing the process and also ensuring that the right people are at the table.
Yeah.
And that might be a different group of right people, you know, from, and I think that is one of the issues with the standing entity that is the community and voluntary pillar, where, you know, they're expecting themselves, or they're expected to be expert in all sorts of things that they may not be expert at all in. So I think that's probably a very good suggestion.
To pick up on, Helen, your earlier point about a process of co-designing, if you like, a reformed democracy, the government might well say, well, we're doing that. It's this thing called the Open Government Partnership, and we've been doing it now for a long time, and it is designed to be like Democracy 2.0, where there's a huge amount of stuff going on both in Ireland and internationally as people propose radical ways. It's a lot of it's tech heavy, using technology and data and so on, but radical ways of reimagining how we do democracy. You know, cities where a touch of a button you can see the accounts of the city where money's been spent. You know, Brazil was holding the World Cup and there was fears of corruption. So to build a stadium, they put every single receipt online, every single payment, every single everything. You could go through everything if you were a diligent journalist or whatever. So, I mean, there's loads of radical examples, but feeding into that, there's long-standing things that work as mechanisms. Again, talk about mechanisms like the citizens' jury idea in Norway, where you take a random group of citizens, but they'll be asked to make a decision. They won't be asked for their opinion. They'll be asked to decide. So, for example, should, you know, here's a road going by your town. Should we follow route A or route B? You know, neither route is perfect, but you 12 citizens will be given the information and you will decide whether we're doing A or B, and the officials will implement it. I mean, that's a radical mechanism where people get to actually make a decision. Now, it's only one example, but I think there are actually quite a number of mechanisms that one can point to. But there is a, you know, division of labor issue as well. Most citizens don't have the time to do this stuff. And if it's only those who have the time to get involved in everything, then they'll dominate and you don't have, it's not democratic anymore. But there is a thing about creating, particularly the transparency, where stuff is available to people. They can see, you know, every step on the way, what decisions have been made, what money's being spent, what's being done. We can do an awful lot more of that.
But I think that giving decision making to a small group of people can also be problematic. So, for example, you set up a citizens' jury to decide whether or not there's going to be a traveller halting site in X place in Galway. Do you know, you may be sure that the answer to that is going to be no, because if it's random selection, you're not going to have a traveller or 6 travellers on that committee. So I just think
that's a bad example. I think that's unfair. I think it's unfair.
I don't think it is. No. I don't think it is, because I would say the same about participatory budgeting. I think if you're going to use those mechanisms, they need to be very, very nuanced.
But I think you have to use the right mechanism for the right decision. I mean, everybody knows the traveller halting site is kind of controversial because there's an awful lot of bias.
So are roads. So are roads.
So are roads are very divisive. But again, it's less particularly focused on a minority community. I mean, roads are difficult issues, but somebody somewhere ultimately has to decide.
They do, but I think you know, there's 2 things that I suppose we need to think about. One is that idea of what Chris spoke about before, and in the document it's there, that idea of elite creep, where you end up with, you know, the same people who are willing to put themselves forward for things. And I don't know how they pick those juries, but you have the same people who are willing to put themselves forward, who are everywhere and on every commission, they're here, there, and everywhere in local areas. Say, probably the same thing happens nationally. And we need to avoid that, but we also then need to make sure that those processes are, from our perspective as the community platform saying this, that we have to make sure that there are ways and means in which those who are, as you were saying, furthest distanced from the state and do not have a voice ever, that they are at the table. Because roads matter to everyone, and oftentimes they matter to poor communities who are more likely to be walking on them than anything. But you know, so how do we make sure that those processes are as inclusive of marginalized groups as possible?
Well, I think, I mean, you could use the analogy of an algorithm that they use. I mean, on social media, you make sure that you represent the different communities. You have your numbers of who needs to be in the room.
Well, that's nearly a quota thing then.
a kind of a quota or a system. But
Mm.
again, that's a mechanism that could be designed.
Yeah, yeah. But I just
So I think that's everybody back. I thought we might just use this whiteboard this time. I just want to see, can you all type into the whiteboard if it's up there in front of you? Are you able to do that?
No, I don't think so.
No, because you're sharing your screen.
Ah.
So it's, yeah.
God damn it. God
Yeah.
damn it. Anyway, I can just type on the whiteboard.
Did you send us a link to it? We don't have a link, I think.
This could be getting a bit too technical for me now.
Yeah, it's clearly got a bit too technical for myself as well. I was just hoping this might share, and then everybody could just add in stuff if you wanted. But it doesn't allow that. Anyway, so what fantastic mechanisms have you got that we can sell worldwide and copyright this whole process? Sorry, Orly, you're muted there.
Sorry, no, I was just talking to my son. Apologies.
Okay. Is there anything interesting?
Not really. Trying to sort out his dinner.
do you have any ideas on mechanisms though?
No, he wants to know what's for dinner.
Oh God, a verbal question.
Okay, what give us a few mechanisms there that are going to deliver those outcomes that we discussed?
Well, just a brief, we discussed that citizens' assemblies might be an example of a mechanism. Now, it's not exactly collaborative governance, but it might be an example. And indeed, you could have citizens' assemblies, for example, at a local level. It doesn't always have to be a national mechanism. It could be a local mechanism too. But we also discussed that, you're going to have different mechanisms for different purposes with a lot of flexibility built in. So you'd need a toolkit, if you like, of different things that could be used. Citizens' juries are used in some jurisdictions to make certain decisions for a local area and so on. So there's different things that could be done.
Yeah, and that same point came up, that it isn't like, it's not a one size fits all. It is about figuring out the best mechanism for the different issue, so that needs to be allowed for. But that we, as in civil society or our sector, needed to be sort of central to deciding on the best type of mechanism, rather than trying to fit into one that the state decides.
And some of the concerns that came up around the likes of citizens, juries, etc., is the random nature of selection, and the fact that random nature of selection will always leave out many of the groups that we're talking about.
Okay, is there anybody who has to leave? I know, Mike, you were saying is there anybody who has to leave that wants to add anything before, and then maybe the rest of us could keep going for another few minutes?
Yeah. I'll head off here. I've got to go. But
want to add anything before you leave? Anything that will leave us all kind of wowed and in awe?
He left our group in awe, but
I suppose the one thing we said at the whatever his workshop thing room is that I was struck by the way in which the report seems to be looking for an overall or overarching new way of doing it, which may be where the government is, or it may just be a hangover from that we had a totalizing social partnership and everything was through that lens. There might be more ways forward by saying, look, here are some good mechanisms and some principles which are applicable in certain circumstances, but maybe not in others, and push them out bit by bit as good practice, rather than look for some sort of overarching new paradigm which is going to take over everything. And with that gem of wisdom, I shall depart.
I saw your life passing before your eyes there. You thought, oh my God, have I got to go back and do that all over again? Been there, done that.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Good to see you.
Mike.
And thanks to see you, Chris.
Bye. Bye. Okay. Anybody else want to add on to that?
One thing I suppose, that came up about flexibility and the need to different approaches, that just because something works doesn't mean you can just replicate it and it'll work again. And maybe there are different approaches that we need to take that are suitable to whatever the purpose is. But also that there are a lot of structures in place that seem to just go on forever. And aren't really serving the purpose maybe that it should be serving. So there needs to be at least reviews, if not things only set up for a certain length of time and then come to an end, a natural end, or every time bound.
Okay, so fit for purpose and time limited mechanisms.
And maybe this goes back to the principle of co-design, co-creation, like that when it is linked to a particular issue, maybe it needs a particular type of design. The mechanism itself, the process itself needs that design that will fit, what it is you're trying to do. Because like say if you're trying to do something with domestic workers, for example, you'll have to go on a Sunday afternoon and meet them all. And, how to engage that group of people are it's very basic stuff that we know for years, but it's kind of, it's that stuff as well. And also maybe not to forget, picking up on what Mike had said, it's not to forget the campaigns and the referendums and the different types of demands that were made over the last number of years. And, I think that's sort of missing from the document. It's like, it's almost like it's in a vacuum, but like there's been huge swathes of wins and change in the last number of years. And I just kind of feel maybe it doesn't make reference, there's no acknowledgement of other ways of achieving change. And I'd hate to see something like this, have a detrimental impact on other ways of working as well. So I think what we're saying is there's a mechanisms are useful, but there's lots of ways as well to create change. So I'd be a little bit concerned that we wouldn't put all the eggs in the basket in this one thing.
There's a phrase sometimes that's used, that distinction between invited spaces and popular spaces. So the invited spaces are these kind of ones that the state sets up, and civil society gets invited into it. And some of the danger can be then that you forget the popular spaces where the other kind of change that you're talking about, can get generated.
We discussed
and
that.
Some of the criticism of social partnership is that there was too much attention paid into those invited spaces, and the other ones were forgotten a bit. But anyway,
we talked about that in our workshop as well, and we talked about that lobbying, that campaigning, that piece, and the fact that in the past a lot of time was spent in social partnership, a lot of resources were put into it, a lot of people's energy, and that really that balance needs to be there all the time, the inside and the outside spaces, and just to keep an eye on that. But I don't know in this document, like how would you stitch it into this document? Just an acknowledgement of it, highlighting
like a little preamble or something, right? More so than not going into it, but just as more in a context.
Yeah, recognition. Yeah. Okay.
The principles document, the platform principles document has that there, that that there are these spaces where dialogue happens or so on, but still there should be respect for advocacy and for alternative approaches as well, to bringing about change, that just everything couldn't be in this approach. So that would be accepted, I suppose, that the sector might engage with it in different places, in different spaces. So one might be the structured approach, or the one might be the popular approach, but the state should respect that too within this.
Like if you're an economist, you might be saying there's an opportunity cost of being involved in these engagement spaces, and maybe naming some of those opportunity costs might be no harm. But
one of the things we were saying that you have to remember is the sheer amount of time that it takes to engage with these sorts of collaborative processes. It takes an enormous amount of time often, and the burden is very often on very under-resourced organisations if you do get involved in these types of spaces.
But what about where there is things that are in, I'm going to say some things are in existence already, like say the PPNs or whatever you want to say, which the partners are, even local government is supposed to view it as public participation. and in which they really pay no heed to, they have no regard to at a local government level. So, I mean, again, we're talking about a new process, that's why I'm saying like something has to really shift, because there are structures actually in place right now that could work really, really well if there was a shift in a mindset at a departmental and a local government for whichever. And because local government and even state agencies, they're very hierarchical, and it's a top-down approach. They operate very clearly from a departmental. I mean, there's no, they have no say, you know, as such. But like there's a total ignoring of existing, of some of the ones that have the potential to work well. I'm not saying they all will or anything else like that, but like some of it is there, and some of us have put a lot of time into them, and they're ignored.
To build on that point, I think the one thing we discussed in the group was the fact that obviously collaborative governance or participatory democracy is going to have to interact with and intersect with representative forms of democracy. I mean, you can't have everybody in the same room with the Taoiseach. It's not going to work like that, but it's about having a much greater dose of participation and genuine participation, particularly at those levels where it will work well with communities directly affected by policies or services. And I think there might be it might be worth in the introduction maybe to elaborate how, you know, there are different aspects of democracy, whether it's the direct democracy of a referendum, whether it's the representative democracy of electing people, whether it's the liberal democracy of people's individual rights being protected in the Equality Acts, protecting people and so on. But then you have the deliberative democracy, which we do reasonably well in Ireland. If you like, you have the PPNs, but you just have public debate in the media and so on. But what's really weak is the participatory democracy piece. We have the citizens' assemblies, but we don't have an awful lot more. And it's about rebalancing the Irish democratic system. Rather than saying we're going to sweep everything away and replace it all with collaborative governance. I don't think that's the intent here. The intent is to say, look, there's a weakness in the Irish system, that we need a lot more participation, and there's huge benefits to bringing in quite specific mechanisms in different places tailored to the needs, because that will generate value. I think that's, if that makes sense, as a way of framing this.
I suppose what I just want question is, so if this discussion and paper is really to put into the arena that has been currently described, social dialogue, there's probably a need to be a bit careful not to broaden out the focus of it too much into the whole array of potential participatory processes at local and national level. So maybe just a word of caution that would come to me on that.
But you would hope that if this is established at national level, that you would see it trickling down to local level, because what's there at local level in terms of democratic structures like SPCs, I think more than PPNs, they're a facade, they're a complete and utter facade. So, you know, it's the culture shift needs to trickle down as opposed to the mechanisms.
I was just going to add, though, I mean, I didn't get a chance to in the group, just we finished, but, you know, from looking at what we've already put in the document, I think we mentioned this maybe early on, but I do think, and we don't have to use but I think there was some positive value in the types of mechanisms that the NESF had. And I think that's worth capturing. You know, I mean, I know people, like, there were problems with it, but some of the elements that we're talking about in terms of the co-design, like like the way the management committee was done, the way that the issues were selected, and also it was quite dispersed amongst our own sector as well. So I don't know, I've been thinking about that a bit more the more we've been sort of talking about different things. And also it did have that dialogue as well with politicians and civil servants and our sector, and that's quite unique as well in that space. So I just wanted to pop that in. Sorry, Chris.
Morning, I hear Maureen Gaffney
I know
on the Brendan O'Connor programme, and I had to put down 3 years on the NESF Management Committee with possibly the worst chair in the world.
I know.
Sorry, Breed.
I just you know, agreeing with just Orla's last point, because I, you know, just thinking, wasn't involved in say the management committee, but it would have been involved in the inclusive labour market piece of work that was done through that, you know. And so certainly there was, like, people were maybe involved in sort of the managing part, but then depending on the issue, people got brought in, you know, and that kind of reflects, I think, some of the discussion we had in our group. But also one of the things that came up was just that whole thing around representation, who decides who's in the room and who is represented and who gets to represent. And then I suppose then that challenge that can arise around feedback and how you're then accountable back to those you are representing, or on whose half you're there, and that in some mechanisms people are asked to effectively agree not to, you know, to sort of in effect not feedback stuff or not to feedback anything in any detail, and the challenges that then presents. And then likewise just that, you know, that kind of concern that, you know, how do you get good, strong national to local communication, both within the sector, but also then within the state itself, because often state players might feel they've been left out of the loop as well. And then across the two, you know, and again, just that which, if we're to see real outcomes or improvements in how work is done, better working methods, so that, you know, so that in effect the state is always using, or whoever is working on something is always using the most up-to-date, relevant information, you know, responding to it, doing it well, being as proactive as possible, and really trying to make sure that the resources that are at people's disposal are being used to best effect, and that those for whom this is a key issue are really seeing outcomes that they feel will make a difference to them. And the perennial issue of resources, of course, came up. But also the issue of training, and people didn't mean training kind of as often is the case, or when to use that term capacity building gets mentioned, it's often all of us are seen as the ones who need capacity building, but really across the board, and particularly I think if we're to see that cultural shift within how the state engages on issues, I think there is that, just that how they do their business and how their business needs to be done better, how that gets built on, and then how maybe good practice, you know, that example that Orla has put in the paper around the Department of Justice, you know, how do we build on some of that, you know, kind of, and other practice, good examples that are there, because sometimes often maybe civil and public servants will pay heed when they feel somebody else has done it or somebody else has taken that step, and that they can learn from their peers, from their colleagues.
I think as well, if the online engagement continues, like some of it's going to remain, you know, in how we dialogue in different spaces, and, you know, some of the mechanisms they're using, you know, Slidos and things like that, like that's not going to give any real depth or discussion, or, you know, good discussions can't be had. So I think just watching that obviously if that continues, that it's used to the best way. I think there's been a loss as well of that you know, the relationships with new people that you meet, new officials, maybe you've only met them online, you haven't met them in person. It's more difficult to kind of build up that rapport. So, but obviously maybe that's going to change as we move into more safer public engagement. But I think it's just something to watch, that we don't let it slide, that kind of low level, you know, online voting and polling and things like that.
Can I just say, I think that's a really important point that Catherine has brought up, because instead of using online to its maximum and to, you know, to use it for the best purposes possible, actually what's happened is they've taken a really reductionist approach to the use of online mechanisms, and use the Slidos or the webinars or other online forums that really reduce participation as opposed to maximizing participation, that there are other things you can use for. In a lot of cases, I'm not saying in all cases, in a lot.
And I suppose they can be quite much more easily controlled as well, and
edited. Just back to the point, I agree with that as well, but just the point Breed was making, in our group as well, we talked about the necessity of cultural change, and looking at public sector reform agenda and where that's at, and if it's possible to engage through that in terms of what might happen there, that there's a responsibility on the state to improve itself as well. So how do we do that through kind of a more public sector reform agenda? I wasn't sure myself as well of the open government partnership process, which is restarted as well, if that's a possible space this could be developed through, or that's separate in terms of how people engage as much as it is about the reform of public sector itself. We had a discussion as well in our group about, or it was raised in terms of how we change, how we do as well, that we need to be conscious of how we engage as well. The person who mentioned is not here, so I'll mention on their behalf, as I suppose that, you know, we have to think of it maybe sometimes from the other side. Yeah, so when we engage to, I suppose, be properly prepared and engage in a constructive way as well at times. So I'm just saying that on behalf of somebody who's not here who brought that point up as well. So sometimes it can be two ways.
Okay. Anybody else? Can you all still see the whiteboard there? Is that?
Yeah, that came up in our group as well. Just also how you know we engage as well. You know.
Yeah. You didn't type in anything about the public sector reform there, Chris, did you?
Oh, sorry.
I just think.
Yeah. Sorry, the public sector reform. Yeah.
I think it's an agenda that we need to know about what's going on, like, because if fundamentally a lot of this stuff is about, you know, how people are treated and, you know, the culture within the civil service as well. I'm not sure if that we're influencing it, but maybe there needs to be something said about it in this paper as well, because it is fundamental. It is because it is about their processes, their systems, how they review themselves, how they evaluate themselves, what they do with that. You know, because there's a bit around, we were talking about measuring, you know, the impact of a particular service or whatever. If 100 people and 50 of them said you're crap, you know, what do you do with that? So there's something about like how is the government measuring itself? How transparent is it in that? We know they're not measuring stuff, but these are things that could be, you know, we could recommend or we could look towards, because there's something about, you know, it is customer engagement, but you know, to make better policy and to make better services. But there's no culture of that. There's no kind of organizational commitment to that at a broader level.
No, like
I would think
the public sector reform process is really about how to get more by spending less. So it's very dominated by value for money. It's very dominated by technical changes and technical reforms rather than cultural reforms, particularly in favor of citizen engagement or participation or dialogue or any of that kind of stuff.
But should we not be saying something about that in this? Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. It strikes me just on that point, there's an important body here, not to be abusing my role as facilitator, but the Institute of Public Administration is very influential. You know, it's the body that trains most of the public servants in the country, but it does nothing on its training really around participation, civic engagement, participatory democracy. If people start getting messages through that kind of an environment, they may also listen to at least.
Who influences them?
The Department of Finance and deeper.
So again, it's coming back to a shift.
But just to say that the Open Government Partnership does have, now it's weak, it is weak enough, but at least it is there. They do have a section on sort of well, actually it is just on consultation. It doesn't go any further than that. But even if nationally and locally public bodies were required to take that on board, we'd be a lot better off than we are now, limited though they are. So there is that element to that open government partnership process as well.
But the fact that they were subject to criticism from the OGP internationally for what 3 years that they just ignored, it's just kind of says something about them and. Anyway,
sorry, I'm going to have to go.
Okay.
Sorry, I think at 5:30.
So I know we're 20 past. Would we? Does anybody have any final burning comments, or will we wrap it up there before
I just want to say, I was just going to say, Chris, as well, in terms of the civil servants and how they're being informed in terms of making policy and developing strategies, like they are using a small pool of consultants and you know, operators as well that are coming from, you know, maybe don't have an expertise in participation and participatory democracy, you know, the Mazars and Indicons of the world. And, you know, there's again, yeah, just narrowing that, you know, that pool of people that are informing the government. And I know they've all kind of procedures about the panel that they use and e-tenders and everything. But like, again, that's probably a mechanism or a process. And maybe that's part of the open government partnership piece, but who actually they get to do this work with them and for them. And then how we engage with those consultants as well, you know.
Maybe the platform needs to set up a sub company, its own consultancy
Start
company.
tendering.
But you know, it's not the maddest notion in the world, because otherwise the line is left open to sorry, Nat.
Sorry, you want to finish your point, Chris?
No, that was it. No.
I wanted to come in on the IPA point, just which I believe now is a college at UCD. I mean, my own experience, I spent 3 years teaching in Ulster University on a master's program where it was co-designed with government officials in the Northern Irish Civil Service at Assistant Sec General level. And most of the pupils, you know, with 30, 40 people doing a master's in public administration were mid-career civil servants. And topics like co-design, engagement, different mechanisms of engagement, that was part of what we were providing them. Not just myself, but various colleagues across health and social care and different topics. That's what they wanted, and that's what they received in terms of the development there of mid-career civil servants and public servants in charge of, you know, significant policies. So you don't have to go very far to find examples where other jurisdictions are doing more than we are. Yeah. And I think it's no harm normalizing a lot of what we're talking about here. I mean, if the IPA isn't teaching it, I think that raises a question for the IPA, but its counterparts in other jurisdictions, I think, probably have a broader curriculum that they offer.
Yeah, because I did an exercise a few years back looking at all the IPA offerings in the programs here at the different levels. Now it's a bit out of date, but I couldn't find anything, any modules that were dedicated around co-design, collaboration, engagement. Obviously, to do the human rights one with IREC, but something like that might be no harm. But getting it into the mainstream, I suppose, is a bit of a challenge. Okay, folks, just before we
one more thing, sorry, Chris. Well, it came up actually in the. It led us to the point about public sector reform and culture change and so on, but it started off in discussion really from traveller organisations, I suppose, but it's maybe wider than that in terms of the lack of respect, I suppose, when they engage for the expertise and experience that people have. And it came up earlier, Mary mentioned in terms of the imbalance of power. So, you know, where people are working on these issues for many, many years and have a lot of experience and expertise and so on, but then they arrive to meetings with officials who, you know, don't respect any of that. So it's about how do you address that? Yeah, they have no intention maybe of seeing your point of view, and also don't recognize that experience you bring or that expertise you have because of your lived experience or because of your work and so on. So I mean, it was a negative point, but it arrived back at that point about cultural change and public sector reform that tries to engage with that. I asked a question about public sector duty and if people thought that might have any bearing on the matter, and there was kind of a bit of silence and saying that that's just kind of moving along so slowly. But anyway, that's a kind of an issue about how do you address that imbalance of respect, imbalance of power.
And can I just I don't know if it's relevant, it's just something that's coming into my head. We talk about all this, you know, new things and new ways, but we have a lot of work went into developing anti-poverty strategies or anti-poverty proofing, equality proofing, gender proofing, etc. And they've gone nowhere. And I suppose there's a lot of things that have actually they're there only to be implemented, but they haven't been implemented because the departments in local government and all of those powers that be have never taken on board the previous work that has already been done. And they were done collaboratively, and they were done oftentimes, you know, with maybe, you know, people that more, and that they didn't have the power within the relevant departments either. you know. So like there are things that are there that can actually be used going forward. That, you know, we don't have to continuously reinvent wheels. But that's there as well. And I'm going to say it, and anybody else who knows me for the last 2 years, there has to be a way better understanding of issues at a rural level, and rural poverty and rural discrimination and rural because it's just non-existence, and the access to services, the access to everything it's lost. It's absolutely lost. So I mean, you know, when we're talking about I suppose regular open engagement with all sectors, there cannot just be one representative of rural Ireland at the table when they do not represent poverty and discrimination. So there is a part to be said where the representation, it's up to the community sector ourselves to actually decide who should be representing us at the table as well. It can't be them.
Very good. So we're at 27 minutes past 5. We could probably keep going for another 2 hours on this. But if we kind of take this, because I think there's really rich material here, and incorporate that back into the paper. Oh, where's my whiteboard gone? Oh,
did you stop sharing?
No, I didn't. No, does somebody stop me sharing? I wonder.
I didn't change anything on my side.
Okay, so hopefully it's not. I hope it's not.
The actual draft, I'm sorry, that paper there is quite good. I mean, like, you know, I know we're talking here, but there's so much that's in that rather than trying to
but it needs,
it's kind of difficult, you know.
It needs shape put on it. Yeah.
I hear you, but the content is
oh yeah, no, it's getting there, but there's a fair bit of work now to put a bit of schmack on it and get it out the fireside.
Yeah. So I think what's here can certainly will certainly enrich the paper. And I had agreed with the working group yesterday that I'm going to do a bit of work to just reshape it. Won't necessarily finish it off, but just to reshape it. I do think there might be a merit in circulating not a survey, but some kind of you know, an email invitation with a few kind of headings in a template to ask people to record best practice experience that you're already involved in. There's some examples in the document, but I think even from today's discussion, there may be others. You know, so it's kind of, what is the mechanism? You know, what way does it work well? Why does it work well? Just to capture some of that might be no harm.
What about missed opportunities for good practice?
Potentially, yeah, where you have structures, but you know, if you have kind of a whatever way the template would be, but we can have a chat maybe about that. But I think there might be, you know, in order to strengthen some of the arguments that are being made here, if it can be demonstrated, well, actually some of this is already in practice. We're not, as you say, Mary, reinventing the wheel completely. Then it makes it easier to show that you're not looking for mad stuff, but that you're looking for stuff that's already in place. I think Nat mentioned this earlier on as well. Okay, would we leave it at that for today? And then I think the working group will probably join back together again. I don't know, at some point, to process some of the stuff from today.
Yeah.
Okay, will we leave it there?
Yeah, great stuff.
Yes, thanks very much, Chris.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks all.
No worries, to make sure that I can download the whiteboard. I don't want to lose it.
Oh yeah,
That would be a bit of a we all just leave and leave you alone?
Yeah, you leave me alone here to sweat and make sure I still have it. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris.
As long as the host doesn't leave, you'll be all right.
Great to see you all.
Happy holidays, everybody.
Bye. Please take care. Bye.
Bye.
You can take a screenshot, Chris, if all else fails. You can take a screenshot of it.
Yeah, I still have it here anyway. So there was.
Have you done stop share? Can you send us a link to it? No.
Before I stop sharing it, I just actually I can see. Sorry,
I've taken screenshots anyway, just in case.
I have 3 screens going on here at the moment. So
can you shift the screens and we can take screenshots for you?
Yeah, I can. I'm just going to save it as a. I can save it as a PDF. In theory, but it doesn't want to let me have that option.
And
Okay,
Paul
so-
do it as the host? Are you just a co-host, Chris? Or are you a host?
I'm a host, yeah. I
Okay.
can just take a screenshot of this here, easy enough, yeah. So
Just have to type it all over again. That's the only downside.
No,
yeah.
we can, if it's a
don't understand
JPEG, we
what's
can
the problem.
convert it. We can convert it back into Word for you, Chris, if you want.
Okay.
We've a little tricky
Yeah,
thing.
you have the technology.
Yeah.
Yep. So let me just do that for that one, and I'll just do the second page then, or the second page, and then I did the other one in a Word document. So
Because you were typing away on this second page and we couldn't see you typing. We could see it all now, but for a long time.
could you not?
No, just the first few paragraphs initially.
Okay. So if the dog here didn't stop, would you ever go away? Can't you see, Bruno? I'm in the middle of something. For
Important.
God's sake,
Nationally
Bruno.
important.
And he reaches at me with the paw then and kind of says, "Pay attention to moi."
Yeah.
Oh.
5:30 now. Come on.
Oh yeah,
It's
tell you,
5:30.
he's a
We're
unionized dog.
still recording, so you might want to stop the record there, Paul.
That'll
Okay.
probably help before I start cursing at the dog.
Yeah.
Sorry, let me just paste that thing in first before I lose anything else. Right, stop share.